The martini is a much argued about and a drink that certainly confuses a lot of people. A good friend of mine once told me it's like a cup of tea, and I think it's one of the great analogies for talking about the martini, because essentially there is no one recipe of martini. Every recipe is really bespokely made for you. However you like to drink your martini, the mood that you're in at that time, how much vermouth you want in your drink, what gin you want, what garnish, etc. All these things create the bespoke martini that you want at the time. Slightly differently, we're going to make today the Marguerite, which is essentially a wet style martini. So what I mean by how wet or dry you have your martini relates to how much of the dry vermouth you have in the final drink. Because English gins are dry, the less vermouth that ends up in the final drink, the drier the martini. The more vermouth, the wetter. And it really is down to you and your preferences and how much you enjoy the herbaceous nature of vermouths and the different vermouths that there are out there. Really depends on how much vermouth you want and therefore how dry you want your martini. The drink we're about to make though is the Marguerite. Now this is a specified martini recipe. 2 parts Plymouth Gin, 1 part dry French vermouth, and just a dash of orange bitters. And orange bitters were very popular in martinis really up until probably the 1950s. Okay, so we're going to make the Marguerite, this classic recipe from 1904. And as I said, it has 2 parts of Plymouth Gin and 1 part of French dry vermouth. There's our French dry vermouth. And there's our 2 parts of Plymouth Gin. And now just a dash of orange bitters. We don't want too much, we don't want it overpowering. Plymouth is a really lovely light style of gin, and we don't want it overpowering the drink as a whole. Ice. Again, we need the ice to drop the temperature of the drink and also to add that all-important dilution. And I'm going to stir, and I'm just going to smell and wait for the aromatics of the gin to be released. And the reason why I'm making this recipe today, as opposed to any other martini style recipe, is because we see this as really genesis for the dry martini that we recognize today. Because all the other recipes that had been named a martini before this were very different to what we'd recognize as a dry martini today. They all had a sweetening ingredient. This is the first time we see a recipe recorded that we'd recognize, if we drank it today, which we're about to, as a dry martini. So there we have it, the Marguerite, a classic martini from 1904, and it's as delicious today as it was then.